I'm Kowalzig, working for Oxfam in Berlin for the Climate Action Network. Now, on mitigation, this conference is a pre-conference for the big UN climate summit in Durban end of this year. So whatever happens at this pre-conference needs to feed into what we need to get out of the Durban COP at the end of the year, which is implementing the Cancun agreements, the decisions agreed in Cancun, and going beyond to address issues that have been left unresolved at the last UN summit in Cancun. One of these gaps that were left is the problem that currently developed countries' emission savings targets are far too low to be consistent with the 2-degree pathway, let alone the 1.5-degree pathway. And the second is how we can increase overall emission of both developed countries and developing countries. And the third one is what do we do in the long run? So when will emissions finally peak and when they will start going down? And what will be the long-term target for the entire exercise to reduce emissions? So these three areas are under consideration here. What we had so far is two workshops, one on mitigation action taken by developed countries, and another workshop on developing country action to reduce emissions. Now, both workshops didn't get us very far, to be frank. The one on the developed country workshops didn't tell us any new information. We knew all of it before. It might help clarifying a few detailed questions, but what was left unaddressed in that workshop was how developed countries can actually increase their ambition, meaning how can they, as a first step, move to the high end of the pledges they've made so far, for instance the European Union going from 20% reduction to 30% reduction, and on the other hand, what will be left then in terms of emissions that need to be reduced even if countries go to the high end of the pledges. So these two questions were not addressed in the workshop. And that is what needs to happen now following the workshops for the next 10 days. The developed countries identify ways and options. Okay, what can we do with the gigaton gap that we have, meaning where pledges will get us to and where we need to be consistent with the 2-degree global warming pathway. And on the other hand, how that contributes to closing the global gigaton gap to which both developed and developing countries will have to contribute. On the side of developing countries, that workshop had little more information because countries from which we didn't have understanding what they were going to do over the next 10 years on addressing emissions. We have some new insights for some of the countries. Again, in our view, many developing countries could do more on their own, but they also could do more if they were given the needed technology and financial support by developed countries, who promised to do so in the Cancun agreements and previously a year before at Copenhagen. So again, this will have to be addressed in the next 10 days. And on the issue of the long-term goals, so where should emissions be in 2050 in order to stay below 2-degree global warming? We have a strategic problem that developed countries are not addressing. So for instance, the European Union tries to convince everyone we need to talk about peaking global emissions and then starting declining them and reaching a long-term goal for global emissions by 2050. Now, with all rights, this is what we actually need if we look at the science, but what the European Union refuses to address is how do we do that? Which country is going to contribute what part to that undertaking? And India has raised the point, for instance. They said, well, we can talk about long-term goals, but we need to also talk about access to sustainable development, by which they mean we want to have an understanding that our development, lifting millions of people out of poverty, is not impacted by the need to address climate change, which means you need to talk between governments. How do we share the globally needed mitigation effort fairly and equitably, so that developing countries can retain their right to development and lifting people out of poverty? And this is what's currently being discussed behind closed doors. We don't have access to it, but we get our information, of course, from our contacts that we have with governments. And we, of course, are trying to influence this. And our main task here in this particular item is to convince the European Union that they need to be ready to not only pushing for a long-term goal in peaking emissions, but also talking about the question, who is going to contribute to that, how much, and what are the underlying principles of distributing the effort that is needed to achieve that.